Good day, everyone. Ronald Day again, Senior Vice President at the Fortune Society, hosting our show, Both Sides of the Bars. Today, we have a pretty interesting topic that we want to discuss with you, and it's debunking the myth why mass incarceration doesn't mean less crime. And I have a little synopsis that I want to share with you. So, in the last decade, nearly all 50 US states have declined in both crime and mass incarceration rates. But according to a recent report by the Sentencing Project, there's a startling disconnect between the two. This report exposes the limited impact of imprisonment on public safety and challenges the notion that higher incarceration rates lead to safer communities. In this particular episode, we're going to have two Washington-based guests, Nazgol Chandnoosh, and if I didn't pronounce your name correctly, I'm sure you'll check me on that, and also Bryan Widenhouse, a senior policy associate, and Nazgol is co-director of research at the Sentencing Project. And we're going to discuss how mass incarceration hasn't been a major factor in the decline in crime since the 1990s. So welcome, Nazgol and Bryan, to both sides of the bars. And we so appreciate you joining us for this really important conversation. I mean, we've been hearing all over the news that crime has been going down, right? And that is a really important issue, especially there's an election happening right now. So crime is always, every time there's election, crime is always at the top of the politician's agenda. But they make it seem sometimes as if crime is actually rising when crime is falling. So I think this is really an apropos time to talk about whether or not there is a correlation between mass incarceration and crime. So I'm going to start with a question with you, Nazgol, that I think is going to give our audience some real insight about these particular trends. So the question for you, Nazgol, is what are the recent crime and incarceration trends, and what are their historical context?
Thank you so much, Ronald. And that was a really great setup in terms of getting us started with this discussion. So recently, what's been happening in crime trends is that up until the pandemic, we've continued the decline in crime rates that began in the 1990s, as you said. In the 1990s, crime rates reached their peak levels, and since then, crime rates had been coming down. That's many different kinds of crimes. If you look at property crimes, violent crimes, they've all been coming down. In the middle of the pandemic, when there was so much upheaval in our society, when so many people got disconnected from the services that they had been receiving, from the communities that were supporting them, unfortunately, the United States experienced a dramatic uptick in homicides. Also an uptick in some other categories of crimes like car theft and carjacking in some places. But since then, again, those levels of crime and for those particular categories have come down again, and we're back to near record low crime rates overall nationwide in most categories of crime. So that's where we're at in terms of crime rates, and that follows a period in which in the 1970s and 80s, crime rates were increasing. So we've got a curve that goes up and then comes down. Now, what's the relationship between that curve and incarceration levels? Well, incarceration levels went up in the US as crime rates were increasing. They continue to go up in the US as crime rates fell. So during the late 90s and the early 2000s, even while crime rates were coming down, incarceration levels were going up. And it wasn't until 2009 when finally incarceration levels hit their peak levels. And then we've been experiencing a modest downsizing in incarceration in the United States. And so, as you mentioned, in the last decade or so, incarceration and crime levels have been coming down at the same time. So it's that kind of relationship where there's not even a clear correlation where we can say, look, when crime rates were going up, incarceration levels went one way, and when crime rates went down, they went a different way. There's just a completely disconnected pattern. And there's a lot of other research that some of which I'll talk to you about later, hopefully, which really emphasizes that crime and incarceration don't have nearly the kind of interconnection that some people think that they do. And so we don't need to incarcerate so many people to maintain the levels of public safety that we have, and even to be able to make our communities even safer.
Thank you for that point. I mean, and it's counterintuitive to a certain extent, because I think the general public they're not like sitting around reading the fantastic reports that are produced by the Sentencing Project. So they might think that, 1 + 1 = 2, and that if we have people getting arrested and going to prison, that automatically is going to be bringing down crime rates, and that there is a strong connection or correlation between the two. And you've already said that is certainly not the truth. And so we're going to come back to that and get a little more context. But I want to go to you now, Bryan, because you have a really interesting experience that I know you're going to share with our audience. So I just want to start with, you were incarcerated in Louisiana, a state with very high incarceration rates. Would you like to share that experience with the audience?
Well, the experience, and thank you again for that, was that when I was 17, I was given a life without parole sentence, and an adult life without parole, and sent to the adult correctional facilities. I spent 31 years incarcerated, so while I appreciate Nazgol's approach to having research and data back up her points, I come from the lived experience to tell her how it really works and what's really going on inside. I'm just not speaking from my experience. When you spend 31 years tightly confined with thousands of other people, you learn their experiences, their life choices, things that they did on an intimate level. And so I'm also bringing their experiences with me as well. I often in my advocacy work speak about things that, for instance, rehabilitation or extreme sentences being a deterrent, which they're not. And I tell the people this, that it didn't deter me, and it didn't deter anybody else who I was incarcerated with. And sometimes there's pushback that they don't believe that. People do cling to some of these myths that extreme sentences or locking people up for certain crimes will bring crime levels down. And we've kind of got entrenched in that ideology, and we're trying to find a way to break out of it. If you think historically over the last 50 years, whatever the crime trend may have been, from crack cocaine to carjackings to current issues today with organized retail theft or fentanyl, the solution or the proposed solution has always been, let's get tough, let's increase sentencing, and this will, quote unquote, solve the problem. Well, it never has, and it never will, because you're not addressing the root causes. And until we break away from this cycle and really put resources towards addressing the root causes that create these crimes or drive these crimes up, it's going to be, just keep going around in a circle. And if I can go back to your opening point where you talked about politics and crime reporting, whenever it comes up, crime is always a serious issue. And even today, this year alone, we made great strides in accurate real-time crime data reporting. And so we have this evidence and data to say that crime rates are extremely low, historically low, but yet we have certain politicians or certain people who are saying, no, it's not, it's up. And so, we're just confusing the issues here. There's a lot of things that we have to get through. It's great to have people like Nazgol bring in the data, the research. It's great to have people like me to be able to come in and say, no, this is what it's really like inside the system. This is how you can address issues and prevent crimes in the future. I'm not going to say there's a magic bullet to prevent all crime, but there are ways that we can properly address the issues and be more productive with our resources.
That information, Yeah, I want to go back to you, Nazgul, with another question, and it has me think about what's happened in New York. The audience knows I was incarcerated in New York State, and I served 15 years. And when I was on Rikers in 1992, there were over 20,000 people incarcerated in those facilities that make up Rikers Island. And now the population in New York City jails is under 6,000. And in 1999, when I was upstate incarcerated, the population was 71, pushing 72,000. And that was the highest number of people that was incarcerated. And we had a high rate at that time as well. But now the rate has actually been dropped to half. There's less than 35,000 people incarcerated. So New York State and some other states have done good work, as I said in the introduction, bringing down our crime rates to, as you just said, Brian, historically low in New York, and then also having much lower incarceration rates as well. So Nazgul, to that particular issue, what's the evidence showing that there's a weak relationship between crime and incarceration, the evidence, so that the audience is aware that it's not just what politicians or others are saying out their mouths, is the evidence that you've collected, the data that you've analyzed, and you've been able to say that this is actually what's going on versus what some other people are saying.
Sure, I can add a little bit more to that. And first, let me just say it's just such an honor for me to be here as a guest with you all, and to be providing some of the sort of academic insights into this that can really build on the personal experience and wisdom that you're bringing to it. So I really appreciate your having me here. And I'm really inspired by the work that both of you are doing. So, Bryan mentioned about not being deterred by long sentences, and that's exactly right. That's exactly what researchers also document. And a lot of times people think, oh, well, we're angry about this particular crime. Let's send people to prison for longer for committing that crime, even though already as a country, we incarcerate people for generally much longer periods of time than other industrialized countries. But still, we see calls for making sentences longer. So, for example, in the next election, Colorado voters are going to be voting on whether they want to make truth in sentencing periods of incarceration longer for people. And this is one of those terms where it sounds good, but what it actually means is keeping people behind bars for several years longer than already that we're doing. And what we know about that, if you're someone who's personally connected to this issue, if you know people who've been incarcerated, or if you read the research about this issue, what's clear is what effect that has is that it incarcerates and incapacitates people behind bars after a period of time when they no longer pose a community safety risk. Most people, researchers show that criminal careers generally don't last longer than 10 years. And so sentences going beyond 10 years are generally keeping people behind bars who are likely to have aged out of criminal activity. Crime is generally a thing that young people engage in. And so it's especially important that for youth under 18, but also for emerging adults, 19, 20, 21-year-olds, we find ways to meet the needs that might be driving them to criminal activity instead of when we catch them, and catching people in the midst of crime or afterwards is extremely rare. So when you look at, we in our crime and incarceration report, we provide an updated what's called a criminal justice funnel, which shows at the very top how much victimization happens. And then it shows how much of that is reported to the police, how much of that leads to an arrest, and how much of that results in incarceration. So when we're talking about incarceration, we're talking about a small sliver of the actual level of volume of crimes that are happening. And so that's why people don't expect to get caught, because generally it's a true fact. They are not caught for crime. And even for crimes, very serious crimes like homicide, a lot of times people don't expect to be caught. And in a lot of places, homicide clearance rates are pretty low compared to where they should be at. So, that's roughly 60% of the time in many parts of the country that someone's arrested for homicide. So that's the case against lengthy sentences, that they incapacitate people when they're no longer a risk to our society. So they're wasting our money incarcerating people into middle and old age. They're not deterring people from committing crime because people don't expect to be caught, or they're committing crimes under the influence of drugs and alcohol. And we haven't done nearly enough as a society to make sure that when people have a substance use problem, they're able to get effective and affordable treatment. That's somewhere where we should be investing in if we really want to prevent crime from happening in the first place and tackle some of the root causes that Bryan was mentioning. And then the third factor I would say is, just the distraction that we have in terms of talking about sentencing and lengthier sentences and more incarceration, and preventing us from all of that prevents us from having the meaningful conversations we really need to be having about investing in root causes. And one other thing I would say is that my work is just very oriented towards lengthy and extreme sentences and why they're not effective. Let me just say, on the shorter end of the spectrum, which is still pretty lengthy in the US, but when people are incarcerated for shorter periods of time for jail incarceration terms or 1 or 2 years in prison, criminologists have shown that a lot of times, especially with respect to jail incarceration, we're doing more harm than good. We're taking people off the streets, away from their family, away from their jobs, and incarcerating them for a short period of time where they're going to be exposed to potentially more trauma behind bars. And then we're letting them out with a criminal record, making it harder for them to get employment, harder for them to get housing, and having lost the job that they might have had previously, having strain their family relationships. And that is a recipe for failure. It is not what you would do if you were to design a system from scratch and figure out when should you use incarceration in order to keep our communities safe rather than cause more harm.
Wow, that was heavyweight stuff. I think you just summarized the entire Sentencing Project report in that answer. So that was really great. And I like the idea of a distraction, meaning that, alerting the public that sometimes we are distracted by these different, issues. It's like we're talking about actually going backwards, because like truth in sentences and all these things have been tried and proving not to work. And they're the issues that actually increase mass incarceration. So actually, we know that this doesn't work, having so many people incarcerated for all the reasons that you just said, and that we should actually be doing the opposite. So thank you for that information. And going back to you, Bryan, just dig into this a little bit more. What's your perspective from FAMM and someone who's directly impacted around why mass incarceration does not work to reduce crime?
Well, there's never been a correlation. The proposed idea is that if we increase sentences and get extreme here, that crime will go down. Where's the correlation? If you look at some of the states that have the most extreme sentencing, they have the highest crime rates. So the evidence is not there to support this ideology or this myth or this theme. And again, going back to what Nazgol said about extreme sentences being a deterrent. And I said before that they're not. People don't commit crimes and then go turn themselves in. They commit crimes in the hopes of that they're going to get away with it. They're not going to get caught, and they do what they can to not get caught. And so I can tell you that all the extreme sentences for people that I served time with, it didn't deter them. It didn't deter me. But I can almost assuredly say that if they knew for a certainty that they would get caught and punished, if the crime was just 1 year in prison, it would drastically be a deterrence. And that's, I think, where we need to spend more resources on, is trying to increase the closure rate on some of the crimes that we have. They're just too low. And what was the other point that you asked? Oh,
no, just about what you thought are the ways, why does mass incarceration not work to reduce crime? And you were already hitting those.
Yeah. And and again, there is the disconnect and the confusion because we have, it is ingrained in certain areas of our politics. And I'll use Louisiana for an example, where I was incarcerated at. During the former 8 years of a Democratic governor, there was some very significant reforms made in criminal justice that saved the state hundreds of millions of dollars. And better than that, a portion of those funds saved were dedicated towards rehabilitation programs for those who are incarcerated and victim services. Now, the new coming governor came in and just basically wiped all that out. And his premise was that crime had went up and was a result of these reforms. But the data doesn't support that. Crime went up across the country in all states equally, many of which these states didn't do the same reforms that Louisiana did. So there's no correlation there for that. But the problem is it's done. So many reforms that were achieved over decades were just wiped out. And we're looking at Louisiana, who's probably projected to double their incarceration population within 5 or 6 years.
Yeah,
thank you. Again, it's all in this hope and belief that it will reduce crime. But when is it going to start? We've been doing this for 50 years. So when are we going to see this result?
Yeah, and that's the idea that, again, as a new politician comes in, you just wipe out policies that were in place that were working to do the things that they were designed to do, and that's to bring down crime and also reduce incarceration rates. It's really, a sad commentary that we keep on this like a hamster, just, spinning and not really going anywhere. And you talked, Nazgol, about how our incarceration rates were so high. And I remember looking at some of these graphs, you like, my goodness, you just see from 1980 how incarceration just went up. I mean, like a mountain. And then all of a sudden you see a little decline. And it's like, my goodness, like we were to the point we had over 2 million people incarcerated and, millions of people on community supervision, just becoming a carceral state. So the last question I wanted to ask you, Nazgol, is what policies does your organization recommend for ending mass incarceration and for promoting public safety? Because that is one of the areas that we want the audience to know, because we want them to be as empowered with this information as possible.
Sure. So we recommend, something that we've been working on for many years is working to get rid of mandatory minimum sentences. Mandatory minimum sentences, just like Bryan can tell you, I will leave that to you, Bryan, because I think you're the expert on that. So I will save that point and move on to the next one, which is a reform that we've been really excited about in the last couple of years has been second look reforms, which allow judges to have to take a second look at someone's sentence after a period of incarceration. So there's really a lot of, when we talk about the issue of mass incarceration, there's a lot of bad news. That mountain of growth that you were describing, that's the 700% increase in prison population that happened, just looking at prisons, since the 1970s, between the 1970s and 2009, 700% increase. And then since then, there's been a 25% decrease. And yet already, we have some policymakers that have cold feet on continuing with reforms. So imagine a 700% increase. We have a long way to go to move away from mass incarceration. But one of the promising reforms that we've seen implemented in a couple different jurisdictions, so for example, in Washington, D.C., where I live, is these second look reforms. And they build on the decisions from the Supreme Court in the last decade or so that have restricted life without parole sentences for people under the age of 18. So that's an area where we've made progress in the courts saying that this is cruel and unusual punishment. We shouldn't decide at the time of sentencing, in most cases, that a young person should never be able to leave prison. And a lot of advocates, legal advocates, and incarcerated people have pushed to say, well, let's extend that kind of acknowledgement to other populations as well. Let's recognize that when someone's 19, they're not that different from someone who was 18, 17, and let's allow them to have a possibility of showing their rehabilitation and redemption and being rewarded for it. And so in Washington, D.C., for example, after people who were under the age of 25 at the time of their crime, after they've served 15 years behind bars, they can petition for resentencing. And this is a reform that's resulted in about 200 people being resentenced and released. And these people have been tremendously successful. They have, or most of the people who've been released have already served 25 plus years. And if it weren't for this law, they'd be behind bars unnecessarily. But now that they're in communities with us, we can see what a waste it was to keep them incarcerated. And so I'm optimistic that with more and more people being the beneficiaries of some of the reforms that have happened, and getting spotlighted and being, general public being able to hear from them, like this program enables folks to allow people to hear from you all, people will realize that there's a lot of lost talent, lost potential behind bars, and we really need to rethink sentencing. And so I'm excited about second look reforms as a possibility of scaling back extreme sentences.
Thank you for that answer. And Bryan, we only have about a minute left. So what is your vision and hope for reforming the system?
Well, following a lot along what Nazgol said, so my organization is Families Against Mandatory Minimums. And so that's, the key point. When I was sentenced as a juvenile to life without parole, the judge he said, I have no other choice to give you this sentence. I don't think you deserve it. So mandatory sentences are a problem a lot. It takes the discretion out of the judge's hands. But definitely second look laws are an area that is growing and we really need to try to implement. FAMM believes that too many people have been incarcerated and too many people have been incarcerated for longer than is necessary. We do stand by the fact that there needs to be accountability for crimes and things like that. But when you over-incarcerate people, you're really wasting the resources. And second look laws do allow us to come back, not just release people, just to come back and reassess. Take another look. Is this sentence still justifiable and merited? And if it is, then the person remains. If not, then they can be released.
Excellent. Wow. This was a fantastic conversation. Thank you both for joining us on both sides of the bars today, talking about this issue, debunking the myth of why mass incarceration doesn't mean less crime. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.